welcome to Coffee and Property, episode 3. My name is David Hanna of Cornerstone, Chairman of Cornerstone Group, Cornerstone Tax and SDLT Refunds. We're the leading UK's property tax advisors specialising in SDLT. We've reclaimed over £15 million in overpaid SDLT from HMRC in the last 12 months alone. And we regularly create content on all things UK property and draw in views and discussions from different areas of the property industry that is of interest to not just property owners, but to property professionals, investors, developers and financiers. And if you'd be interested in being a guest on Coffee and Property, you just want to watch this first before you decide on that, then get in touch with us and join us on an episode where we can chat about your particular area of property and your take on the property market, the property industry, inflation, the war in the Ukraine, whatever, generally, we can do that. Now, this webinar will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after we finish, but let's get started. Welcome. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Harriet Dunn of Title Split. And Harriet, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
I will do, David. Thank you. First of all, I just love the amount of, was it 15 million you've recovered?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely stunning last year.
Yeah.
The fact that there seems to be I call it a habitual habit of overpaying SDLT is slightly worrying to me as a professional, I have to say.
So it leads into, I suppose, who I am and why I'm on here. So as you said, I am a co-founder and owner of TitleSplit.com with my business partner, Rachel Knight. And my background is I was a commercial property solicitor for nearly 25 years. And I'm now an international property trainer, focusing very clearly on title splitting, which I'll touch a bit more about. But I think the fact there is that gaping gap is it's very often with stamp duty, it falls between the lawyers and the accountants, doesn't it? And the lawyers tend to avoid it. They don't want to really do it, which is why it's such a specialist subject, just like title splitting is really. People think it's easy, but it's not.
So, I mean, the topic of today's discussion is why leasehold is changing. So we've got our coffee. Well, hopefully you've got yours. I've certainly got mine.
I've got my coffee.
So, Harriet, what is title splitting and how is that changing leasehold, or what is changing in leasehold?
Right. So when you have a piece of land and you cut out a piece of land, it's changed at the land registry, and that is the simplest form of title splitting, which is not really what we're going to chat about today. When you actually look at subdividing a building, and today we're going to focus on residential, you can do it on commercial, but we'll just focus on residential today. When you cut up a building physically, you create lots of different units, which is a fantastic way to basically increase your valuations, increase your income. But we call it, by just doing the physical alterations and not doing the creating correct leaseholds, we call it half a job, because you're not maximising the benefits. And interestingly, it links very much to what you do, David, because it also you're not maximising the stamp duty benefits either. Okay. But what I wanted to talk about today is the absolute changes and revolution that the government is bringing in the world of leasehold. So if you think about it, if you own a house, you generally own the freehold, you own the land, and you own the buildings. And subject to planning permission, etc., you can do pretty much what you want with that house, subject to any sort of local Article 4s and things like that. However, when someone buys an apartment, it is generally a leasehold. And what people don't realise is leaseholds have been around literally since the 1590s. And they are, again, I said 1590s, it's ridiculous. And they are so onerous and they are so unfair. They are so onerous and they are so unfair. And the government's been looking at this for quite a lot of years. The first time they looked at it was 2002, when they looked at bringing in common hold, which is something we train people on. But it never really happened. And the reason it didn't happen is they were very landlord developer unfriendly. So why would a landlord or a developer do something that would make them less money? So nothing really happened with it. So, I mean, that's 20 years ago when I trained on that.
I thought it was just the reaction of people in London who were, darling, we'd never do anything so common. So,
well, maybe they shouldn't call it common hold. You could be right there, David. So over the last sort of 5-6 years, they've realised they're going to have to update leasehold. So problems with leaseholds, they're decreasing terms. So I know when I was a solicitor, I acted for a lot of developers. They only ever gave 130-year leases, for example. Well, the reason they only gave 130-year leases was they knew that every year that went past, the lease got shorter and shorter, and the poor person that owned that apartment had to pay them more money to go extend the lease.
Mhm.
So it was a way of not recurring, it was a way of retaining wealth for them in their old age or their children or their grandchildren. So it was a wealth strategy all
Yeah.
along. It was nothing to do with people living in homes. The other thing that started to happen over the decades, and you know this, well, everyone listening knows this, developers and the owners of these freeholds got more and more greedy, and they started putting the ground rents up. So we've all seen it in the press, ground rents were 1,500 a year, ground rents were doubling. And it's really unfair because it means just ordinary people living in their homes get trapped. They're trapped in these leasehold apartments with ground rents that are really, really high, leases that are decreasing in term. And the only way they can get out of it is to pay more money, which they often don't have, to landlords, which is very often, hate to say it, big pension companies or very wealthy people.
Yeah.
So the government's been looking at this for quite a few years, and they've been doing it quite quietly. It's not sexy, it's not exciting, so it's never in the press. But actually what they're doing is really, really good, and it really helps the small person, the person just wanting to get on with their life in their apartment. So the first thing that they've done, and there's a lot of wealthy landlords who are slightly quaking in their boots at the moment, shall we say. So the first thing they've done, and it's coming in this summer, but it came law in February this year, is any future leases, and it's terrifying, David, how many solicitors don't know this, the ground rents can now be no more than a peppercorn.
So they've locked that down completely now.
Completely now for future leases. Now, people say, why a peppercorn? So a peppercorn has no value. It's actually traditionally, we used to talk about peppercorns because if you go far enough back in history, pepper was actually more valuable than gold. So it's quite historical. I quite like history. So it's a peppercorn because it's sort of a bit of a tradition. So that now means if somebody buys a brand new leasehold property today or an existing leasehold property today, they're stuck with a ground rent. Now that's a bit scary because if ground rents go above about £250 per year, some banks won't lend anymore.
So essentially making the properties unsaleable at that point.
It's scary. Whereas someone who creates the way that we train our clients, so let's just look at it from a landlord's perspective now. So for all our clients, because we work with landlords who are developing their properties to create multiple incomes from one building, we always work with them to create what we call friendly leases that are comparable with common hold. So what the government has now said is any new leases, the ground rent is basically zero. It's a peppercorn. So if you're somebody looking to buy a property today and you're looking at a new build or a new property, a new lease that's being created, and you look at one that's been around a month or two before, as a consumer, you're going to buy the property with the peppercorn rent.
Indeed.
So that's good for consumers because for consumers' perspective, it's more protection. And also if you create the friendly leases the way we train our clients to do, from a landlord's perspective, as the property developer's perspective, you're going to be attracting all those buyers and get higher valuations than people who are still doing the old-fashioned ones.
So, I mean, you were saying that you're going to fractionalize a building into multiple units. We're going to have leases with a peppercorn on a ground rent. Presumably that doesn't interfere with the flat management companies, as we call them, the management of common areas and service charges. That hasn't been affected by the government. Is that right?
Well, it has been affected in two ways. If you have a fair management company who is very often owned by the owners of the apartments, who is just insuring the building during the repairs, they're not making money on it, they're fine. But when you get these large management companies, excuse me, who are actually making their money on ground rates, high ground rents and administration charges, for new leases, they're no longer allowed to charge the administration charges either.
Oh.
Exactly. So there's a lot of businesses out there by these managing agents, and their business model is to make money from administration charges and ground rents. Well, it's gone. For future leases, that model has gone.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was talking to two well-known billionaire brothers on Park Lane who actually had a fund that specialised in buying up ground rents.
Yes.
I bet they're gutted.
Well, they will be. Now, I was going to say, there'll be people listening and thinking, hang on a minute, that's for new leases. I am now stuck. There will be people listening who are stuck in existing leases. Now, there is good news coming up. So one thing is, say there's very often where people renew their leases, so they extend their leases.
Mhm.
When they extend their lease, the new extension, that will be a peppercorn. But
Right.
also, that's really good. And then so that's just, but this is only the first phase of the changes. So there's a lot of people sat there thinking, oh, the government won't do anything else. Well, they will. So the second phase of the changes, and I don't know where this will come in, this is for people now who already own leaseholds to give them some heart and something to look forward to. At the moment, if you want to sort of buy the freehold or you want to extend your lease, it's called, you have to pay the landlord money, and it can be a lot of money. Even where I'm based in Hull, it can be 20,000, 30,000 pounds, and that's a lot of money to somebody. It's called a marriage value. They're also looking to get rid of that as well. Don't know when it'll be.
Sorry, would you get rid of marriage value or just get rid of
Yeah.
marriage?
No, come on, David. We don't need to get rid of marriage.
No, absolutely not. No, it's interesting because I had a client in London who bought a property with 7 years unexpired,
Well, that's
and
going to be interesting.
and he paid about 500,000 for the 7 years, but the extension was in 4 or 5 million pounds. So it's not just, it actually affects a lot of properties in central London and the better districts, because Grosvenor and other granted these long leases, maybe
That's why they did it.
125s, but they did them 100 years ago, and now we're starting to see this I call it interesting marriage values coming up on extensions.
And the other thing they're going to do, because there will still be something payable, but it won't be how it is today, but they're also going to have a separate scenario. So we've talked about the big properties in London, but let's say you've got a smaller property somewhere, and actually the property itself, the apartment, I don't know, it's somewhere in the north maybe, and it's only worth 80,000. But they want to extend your lease. They maybe want 30 or 40,000 off you. It's not worth it. So the government's actually looking at putting a new formula for cheap properties as well. So you'll have one formula for your big ones in London and another formula for your smaller properties.
Oh,
yeah. So
well,
no, go on, sorry.
I mean, this is fascinating and slightly sort of not in the direction we were heading, but I mean, I'm kind of pleased to hear this, because we've all heard of people, and not necessarily just in Hull. I mean, down here in the East Midlands, I've seen properties where people are paying ridiculous amounts in service charges, and potentially ground rents. And I mean, a member of my family has just bought a new freehold,
right,
on a former pit estate, but with it comes the obligation to pay for the common areas maintenance, i.e. the parks and playgrounds. And I'm like, hold on, this is freehold, what's going on?
well, I just going to say, it ties back to what you said at the beginning of this, is there's not enough professionals out there that when someone is buying a property, whether it's looking at the leasehold or it's looking at the stamp duty, and it's really sad to say they don't often know what they're doing. And people end up, and got to remember that the industry that we're in, David, whatever industry is the industry we are in is the property industry. And the property industry is all about creating homes for people to live in. That's fundamentally what with the business that we're in. And what you have to think about is this is an amazingly a good thing the government has done, because it's now putting leasehold on par with a freehold. So whether you're looking now at buying a freehold or a leasehold, you can have in the future the same sense of security, sleep better at night, have less pressure on your finances. So although they're doing it slowly, if you actually think about the person living in that apartment, it's going to be improving their lives.
Yeah. I think we all welcome that. Everybody needs security in their lives, and I find it fascinating that the government has moved on this, and I call it by steps, seeking to improve the lots of leaseholders. Going back a little bit to this idea, you talked about one of your owner clients, your landlord clients, they own the property. Let's say it's got 4 flats in there. We're going to actually, I'm assuming by the term title split, we're going to create 4 leases.
Correct.
And that kind of reverses the presumption, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In this case, the sum of the parts is actually greater than the whole. In other words, intrinsically, it makes the property more mortgageable for the landlords.
Well, this is it, you see. So up to now, so for the last 500 years, whenever you talked about freehold, leasehold, title split, everybody looks at the value is in the freehold. And to be fair, up until about a year or two, the value always was in the freehold, which was why these big wealthy people buy lots of freeholds. But because of the government's change and the way things are changing towards common hold, now more of the value is actually in the leasehold. So where we might have not, where in the past where we may have just created 4 apartments and not worried about the leasehold, now it's imperative that we do the leasehold as soon as possible to enable us to get the increased valuations, bricks comparable valuations, and to be able to. And then the other beauty is, of course, you think about this, Dave, which comes back to why I like talking to you about stamp duty. Makes us complete nerds, doesn't it? I'm sorry. Is that if you have one building and you subdivide it physically into 4 units, you then create the 4 individual leases. You can then sell the leases individually. You can refinance them individually. You're sweating the asset, but you're doing it in a way that is friendly to anyone who may buy it. The leases are friendly, so anyone who might want to buy them in the future when you sell. But they're also friendly to the valuers, because who's most scared at the moment about a property crash? The valuers. For your refinance.
And I think most thoughts are that, if, to want for a better word, if there is to be a crash, and you and I could probably spend the next 2 hours arguing that point, intrinsically, the lower value properties, i.e. the building that's been sliced into 4 portions, those portions will depreciate less than if they were still in a whole, because lower value properties are likely to remain in high demand, even through a crash. So in that sense, slicing things up makes sense. I mean, we saw a case last year which was very much that. Somebody owned a property, they converted it into, funny enough, 4 units, and they needed to create 3 leases. Why? Because they were going to let 3 upper floors and actually live in the basement. Different. So it's kind of it was I was like, whoa, this is interesting. How are we going to, how are we going to do this? And we managed to come up with an arrangement whereby we were able to grant the long leases without any SDLT. Interesting. And then they were able to go and take buy-to-let mortgages on each of the individual units, pay down their existing debt, clear the private debt essentially, and then they retain them and let them on ASTs. But logically, they could have then sold each of those leases off. Yeah,
or kept some or sold some. And if you think of it from another perspective, not only is that creative and it's good for them. Now so that's them as a homeowner, the person living in the property, but you now see it as a property investors or landlord's perspective. Whenever they're going to refinance, the mortgage broker and the valuer that are coming in and the bank that's looking at it, their shoulders are relaxed, because ultimately, if you default on the mortgage for whatever reason, they don't have to put a multi-unit freehold building in an auction to sell, only to be bought by property investors who are going to want a discount. They just stick it on Rightmove and sell the apartments. Yeah. So it's a win-win for everybody. It's a win-win for the banks. It's a win-win for the actual owner, the property investor. But when you go to sell, or for the homeowner living in that apartment, it's a win for them, because their leasehold becomes comparable with freehold.
Yes, indeed. No, I can absolutely see the logic in it, and I'm sort of sitting here going, well, there's actually nothing controversial in this, in the sense of it's just leveling a playing field in valuation terms and security terms. So you did mention a crash or a slowdown. What is your perspective? Because we've all got these differing views.
Right. So I think it's very unusual times. So David, I don't know how old you are, but I think you're a similar age to me. So you will remember, no doubt, when we had the crash in the 1980s.
Yes, indeed.
Now, if you go back and actually look what happened to property prices in that crash, property prices didn't actually go down in certain parts of the country at all. So the economy crashing does not always equate to property prices crashing. Now, I think the difference now in 2022, the real problem now is there's not enough supply of properties. So even if people are getting repossessed, people are losing their jobs, and there's struggling hard times, there is still a massive shortage of homes. And while ever there's a shortage of demand, things are going to level, aren't they? Even if prices don't increase as much, I just can't see them dropping because of the amount of demand for the shortage of homes.
I'd have to agree with you. Funnily enough, I was asked by a journalist for this comment this morning.
Oh, I'm glad we agree.
there's still an excess of demand over supply in this country. We have got, and here's an interesting point, and we did a video on this yesterday, it's going to be on YouTube later this week. We've got mortgage interest rates at 3%, average salary increases at 4%, and inflation at 5%, well actually 6% maybe, or 7%, but that's probably a short-term blip. In real terms, interest rates are negative, aren't they?
Well, exactly. And also, I'm sure, like you, I mean, I remember the day, because we owned 2 properties at the time, because we started young in property. I remember the day when interest rates were 18%. It was only for a week. Interest rates were 18%. I remember when it happened, because we had, and of course, that was before buy-to-let mortgages even existed. It was on our residential. So when we talk about, and most of our lives, interest rates have been, what, 4 or 5% on our mortgages. That's quite normal for most of our lives. So at the point at the moment, interest rates are really low. They are really low.
They're incredibly low. And you know, this is where I think we kind of run the risk of over focusing on inflation and not looking at things. We've got wage inflation because of a shortage of labour supply. People saying, I can't get anybody to do these jobs unless I put pay up.
Yeah,
I had a friend over about 8 miles away over here. He reopened up his industrial catering factory after lockdown, and he couldn't. The jobs that he was getting at around £9.50 an hour, he couldn't get anybody to do them at £13.50 an hour. He's now actually, funny enough, robotised his lines, but he's had to invest nearly £1 million in robots because there simply aren't the people who want to do the jobs at the rate. But that seems to be endemic across all sectors. So
it's across everything. It doesn't matter what you're doing, what sector you're in. There's a massive shortage of supply.
So we've got an undersupply of housing. We've got demand. We've got people's wages growing faster than the interest rates. So technically, they're actually improving their affordability, allowing for the increase in consumer and energy costs. And we've potentially got this influx of inward immigration. And I'm just going to, for the benefit of the audience, we've not only got the possibility that we're going to have Ukrainian refugees coming here who will need accommodation, which will need to be satisfied by the private rental sector ultimately.
And don't forget everyone coming out of Hong Kong as well.
I was going to say, we've also got what's called the Hong Kong rush happening over the next 3 years.
Hong Kong rush as well. But when you look at it, the other thing I've noticed happening, particularly, and maybe this is a silver lining, David. I'm noticing a lot of people are leaving the south and southeast and moving north to make housing more affordable. Now that actually, I know the government has the levelling up, but we won't necessarily talk about that. But the fact we've got a population moving from the southeast to the south, at the end of the day, that is probably a good thing because that's going to help bring up other parts of the country that aren't as affluent. So that might actually be a side effect of all this. And I'm not talking about HS2. I'm talking about people upping sticks, moving the children and starting a new life in different parts of the country.
Well, again, one of the questions I had this morning was, do you think rural property and properties more distant from London, you can tell it was a London journalist, more distant from London, are their prices going to collapse as people move back to London? And I went, no. The psychological need for space and access to green space that was created by the pandemic, it's going to be with us for at least another 8 years. You know, I was reminded of the story that when we had London suffered the Black Death, it lost 30% of its population, not to death, but to migration away from the cities. And it took a decade for London's population to come back to that level. That tells you that the people that left didn't just move back when it was all over.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the same paradigm. But people moving. We're in the East Midlands. I've seen people move into Nottinghamshire and up towards your way because of the cheaper property. It's kind of a downsizing without having to go down in size. It's capital liberation.
Well, what you find is they actually get a bigger house. Well, it's more than that. They get a bigger house. But it's more than that. They get an improved quality of life. They don't have to worry about the traffic. There's no congestion charge. There's better facilities. The children can walk to school. And once they say a different way of life, they're not necessarily going to go back to London. But then that's probably the cycle of London, hasn't it? For hundreds of years, it's a new influx of people. And most people living in London are not in their 50s and 60s, are they? It tends to be younger generations, really.
Yep. But for the benefit of the audience, Harriet is a charter member of the Move to the Northeast marketing campaign. No, she's She's a proud northerner, and I'd never strike her down for that. But it's interesting, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's a wide, we talk about this, but this is a wider issue in the overall heating. I don't think we're going to see a collapse. I don't think we're going to see a crash. I think we're probably going to see systemic house price increases above the rate of inflation. We're going to see a lot of inward migration, and we simply can't build them fast enough in this country, which is another issue.
Of course, that brings us full circle, because, of course, one of the other big pushes by the government, again, which they don't put out there in the press very much, is because they have relaxed the planning laws to allow for permitted development, which is aimed at small developers. A lot of these sort of not inner cities, but part of the cities that have become a bit run down, they're encouraging the creation of apartments and leases, or, when you get apartments. So what we can provide as this sort of property sector, the private property sector, what we can provide, and they are relying on private small developers to do this. The big developers build big housing estates. It's the small developers who take larger buildings and convert them into apartments.
Yeah, I was, funny enough, looking at one this morning on behalf of a client, and it's an old commercial building in East London, and it's going to be converted into 4 apartments.
There you go. So you're taking and converting something which is actually providing the need for homes, which is actually why the government has relaxed the planning for permitted development and changed all the leasehold rules so that they're actually making the private sector do what they should be doing.
To a degree, I think that if you Britain, if you open up the opportunity, you say, look, guys, you can legally do this. We can get these old factories, old offices, and old shops that people no longer want. Step up Debenhams, but hey, Oxford Street could become a garden square the way the big retailers are pulling out. I've been telling that gag all the way through the pandemic, but this is what will happen. We will have new apartments in cities out of old commercial space. We will have better lifestyles for the occupiers of those apartments. I've seen some of the designs, certainly on larger buildings where they're being converted. They're putting roof gardens in. They're putting they're amazing facilities. And then you look at some of the work. Sorry to mention the other side of the pennines. You look at some of the designs for brownfield sites in central Manchester. They're stunning.
They are stunning.
Absolutely stunning.
Of course, they're also eco-friendly, because
yes, they are.
They're building them with I don't know what the expression is, where the water is all recycled, and they're gorgeous, and that's something that should be encouraged, really.
Well, slightly off the topic, we've talked about why leaseholders change it.
It was supposed to be coffee and property, so I think we succeeded.
I think we don't manage that. So, I don't see any questions in the question and answer box. If any of the attendees want to ask us a question, you click the Q&A button and type your question. We'll do our best to answer them. This was very much a social chat, very much getting Harriet's perspective on things and telling us all about what these changes are. And I think we've had an interesting time today, Harriet. And thanks very much for coming on.
You're very welcome.
It's been an interesting episode, and hopefully many people will watch it when we put it on YouTube, and we will, without a doubt, be talking again soon. All right.
Thank you for
to everybody out. Thank you for coming on. Everybody, thank you for listening. This has been Coffee and Property episode 3. I'm David Hanna. Thank you. Bye.